Stop seeking approval and change everything. Stoic philosophy for self-respect. There is a quiet prison many people live inside without ever seeing its walls. You wake up, you go through your routines, you speak with people, you make decisions that seem small and ordinary. Yet beneath many of those choices there is a silent question shaping your behavior, often without you noticing. What will they think of me? It appears in subtle moments, before you express a real opinion, before you choose a different path, before you say no to something that drains you. A small hesitation appears, almost automatic, and suddenly your mind begins calculating reactions. Will they approve? Will they judge? Will they misunderstand? Most people believe anxiety about the future comes from uncertainty about events. But very often the real anxiety is about something else entirely. It is the fear of how others will interpret our actions. So you adjust yourself. You soften your words. You delay decisions. You replay conversations long after they end, searching for signs of approval or rejection. A single critical remark can follow you for days. A moment of praise can lift your mood far beyond reason. Without realizing it, your emotional stability begins to depend on reactions that were never yours to control. The Stoics recognized this danger long before modern society amplified it through social comparison and public validation. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that the judgments of others are only shadows, unless we allow them to govern our mind. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 30, he reflected on how easily people surrender their peace by caring too much about the opinions of those who barely understand their inner life. Pause for a moment and consider this carefully. If your peace rises and falls according to someone else's judgment, then who is truly in command of your life? Approval begins to behave like an invisible ruler. It shapes the tone of your voice, the risks you are willing to take, the ideas you dare to express, and even the ambitions you allow yourself to pursue. Not because the world explicitly demands it, but because somewhere along the way you began to associate acceptance with safety and rejection with danger. What begins as a desire to belong slowly becomes dependence, and dependence slowly becomes fear. The tragedy is that most people never question this pattern. They assume it is simply the cost of living among others. They believe peace will come once they are respected enough, liked enough, validated enough. But Stoic philosophy offers a radically different understanding. Peace does not come from managing the opinions of the world. Peace comes from governing the judgments within your own mind. This video is not an invitation to reject people or withdraw from society. The Stoics never advocated isolation from human relationships. They demanded something much more difficult: to live among people without surrendering your inner authority to them. And the first step toward that freedom is recognizing the quiet force that has been influencing your life for far too long. Because once you see it clearly, something important begins to change. The silent tyranny of approval. Approval rarely arrives in the form of an obvious command. No one openly declares that your worth depends on their opinion. No authority formally announces that your peace will be decided by the reactions of others. The tyranny is far more subtle than that. It enters quietly, disguised as good manners, cooperation, or social awareness. At first it feels harmless, even virtuous. You adjust your tone to avoid unnecessary conflict. You soften your opinions to maintain harmony. You consider the feelings of others before speaking. These gestures are not wrong in themselves. They are part of living among human beings. But something delicate begins to happen when this instinct grows beyond moderation. You start editing yourself more often than expressing yourself. You hesitate before saying what you actually believe. You delay decisions that might provoke criticism. You measure your words carefully, not according to truth or reason, but according to how they might be received. At first, this process feels responsible. You tell yourself you are being thoughtful or strategic. Yet slowly, the center of gravity in your life begins to shift. Your actions are no longer guided primarily by your own judgment. They begin orbiting around the anticipated reactions of others. Before you act, you imagine how it will appear. Before you speak, you imagine how it will be interpreted. What should be a life directed by reason becomes a life negotiated through perception. This is the silent tyranny. It does not force obedience through threats. It controls behavior through the constant anticipation of judgment. Epictetus warned about this kind of surrender with remarkable clarity. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 29, he explained that the person who fears the opinion of others has already handed away something more valuable than reputation. They have handed away their freedom. Look closely at how this tyranny operates. You remain silent in moments where honesty would have been appropriate. You continue paths that no longer reflect your character because changing direction might invite criticism. You seek approval for choices that should belong entirely to your own conscience. Gradually, a strange reversal takes place. Instead of asking whether your actions are just, rational, and aligned with your values, you begin asking whether they will be accepted. The question shifts from, "Is this right?" to, "Will this be approved?" Once that shift occurs, the foundation of your inner stability begins to erode, because approval is not a stable force. It is unpredictable, inconsistent, and dependent on countless factors that have nothing to do with your character. One person praises what another condemns. One moment invites admiration, while the next invites suspicion. If your peace depends on something so unstable, then anxiety becomes unavoidable. You find yourself constantly scanning the emotional atmosphere of every room, every conversation, every decision. You begin living as though life were a performance judged by an invisible audience. And the exhausting truth is that the audience itself is unstable. Today they applaud, tomorrow they criticize, next week they forget entirely. Marcus Aurelius observed this same instability when reflecting on reputation. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 3, he reminded himself that the people whose opinions we chase are themselves temporary, distracted, and often inconsistent in their own judgments. Yet we allow their passing impressions to disturb our inner life. Think about what this means. You are adjusting the direction of your life according to voices that change constantly, and minds that cannot even govern themselves. No wonder the result is restlessness. The Stoics did not suggest ignoring people entirely. They understood that human beings live in communities and relationships. What they rejected was something much more dangerous: the habit of placing your inner peace under the authority of external judgment. The moment approval becomes the compass of your decisions, your character stops leading, and your fear begins leading instead. And once fear becomes the guide, something deeper begins to happen. Your sense of worth slowly migrates outside of you. This realization leads to the next discovery, one that many people avoid confronting. Because when approval becomes the source of validation, your worth is no longer yours to define. When your worth is outsourced. The moment your sense of worth begins to depend on the approval of others, something subtle but powerful happens. You begin to live in a state of emotional exposure. Your stability is no longer anchored inside your own judgment. It becomes tied to reactions, expressions, and interpretations that exist entirely outside your control. A compliment lifts you higher than reason would justify. A criticism sinks deeper than truth would allow. You may not notice the shift at first. In fact, it often feels natural. Human beings are social by nature. We want to be accepted. We want to belong. But somewhere along the way, this healthy instinct can become something far more dangerous. Belonging turns into dependency. Instead of relating to others as equals, you begin to look at them as silent judges of your value. Their reactions become signals that your mind reads constantly. Approval becomes reassurance. Disapproval becomes a threat. And once this system takes hold, your emotional life becomes unstable, because you have quietly transferred the authority to define your worth into the hands of people who cannot possibly carry that responsibility, not because they are malicious, but because they are human. Their perceptions are incomplete, their moods change, their opinions fluctuate. Yet your mind begins to treat those shifting impressions as verdicts about your character. Seneca addressed this confusion with striking clarity. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 76, he wrote that the judgment of the crowd is not a measure of virtue but merely a reflection of what the crowd happens to admire in that moment. This distinction is essential. The admiration of others is not proof of worth, and their disapproval is not proof of failure. Both are simply reactions shaped by perspectives you cannot fully see. Yet when worth is outsourced, every reaction begins to feel personal. A delayed response becomes rejection. A disagreement becomes disrespect. Silence becomes a sign that you are somehow lacking. Your mind begins constructing narratives to explain every shift in how others behave toward you. Slowly, the center of your emotional life moves further and further away from you. Imagine trying to stand firmly while the ground beneath your feet keeps moving. That is exactly what happens when your worth depends on external validation. Stability becomes impossible because the source of validation itself is unstable. This is why people who chase approval rarely feel secure even when they receive it. A compliment brings relief, but only temporarily. Soon the mind begins searching for the next signal, the next confirmation, the next reassurance that everything is still acceptable. What should have been a moment of appreciation becomes another link in a chain of dependency. The Stoics saw this pattern clearly. Epictetus taught that the person who places their good in the hands of others becomes a servant to those opinions, not because anyone explicitly enslaves them, but because they voluntarily surrender the authority that belongs to them alone. Consider how many decisions people make under this invisible pressure. They pursue careers that earn admiration rather than fulfillment. They maintain relationships that preserve approval rather than honesty. They silence thoughts that might provoke disagreement even when those thoughts reflect their deepest convictions. All of this happens quietly, almost automatically, because the mind has accepted a dangerous premise. It believes that worth must be confirmed externally. But Stoic philosophy challenges that belief at its root. Worth, according to the Stoics, is not granted by applause or revoked by criticism. It arises from something far more stable: character. The way you think, the way you choose, the way you act when faced with difficulty, temptation, or uncertainty. These are the only things that truly belong to you. Everything else, including praise and reputation, exists in the minds of others. And once you see this distinction clearly, a difficult question begins to emerge. If your worth does not belong to them, why are you working so hard to convince them of it? This realization leads directly into the next problem most people face without recognizing it. Because once your worth depends on approval, you begin paying a constant emotional cost just to maintain it. The emotional tax of pleasing everyone. Once your worth depends on approval, life begins to demand a constant payment from your energy, your clarity, and your courage. This payment is rarely obvious. It does not appear as a dramatic sacrifice. It accumulates quietly, in small daily moments, where you choose comfort over truth and acceptance over authenticity. You adjust your opinions slightly so they do not disturb anyone. You soften your boundaries so they appear agreeable. You delay difficult conversations because you fear the tension they might create. Each adjustment seems small, almost insignificant, but together they form a pattern. You begin managing impressions more than expressing yourself. This is the emotional tax of pleasing everyone. The mind becomes busy calculating reactions. Before speaking, it measures the possible consequences. Before acting, it anticipates how the action will be interpreted. Even after interactions end, the mind continues working, replaying moments, searching for signs that everything was received well. Did that sound arrogant? Did that seem rude? Did they misunderstand what I meant? Hours can be spent revisiting conversations that no longer exist. While the body is present in the current moment, the mind is still negotiating with the past, trying to repair impressions that may not even matter to the other person anymore. This constant monitoring drains something essential from your life: clarity. Because when the mind is occupied with managing approval, it has less space to focus on reason. Decisions become slower, speech becomes cautious, action becomes hesitant. Seneca observed this tendency with remarkable precision. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 9, he warned that the person who seeks universal approval is forced into endless adjustment, because every individual carries different expectations. Trying to satisfy all of them requires continuous compromise. and compromise when it abandons principle becomes self-neglect. Consider the hidden weight of this habit. You walk into a room and immediately begin reading the emotional temperature. You sense who approves of you and who does not. Your tone shifts slightly depending on who is listening. Certain opinions remain unspoken because they might disrupt the atmosphere. Over time, this constant self-monitoring becomes exhausting. Not because the situations themselves are difficult, but because the mind is performing multiple calculations at once. It is not only participating in the conversation, it is also evaluating how the conversation is being received. Living this way creates a quiet tension that many people carry for years without understanding its source. They feel drained after social interactions. They feel anxious before expressing disagreement. They feel uneasy when someone seems displeased with them. The exhaustion does not come from the interaction itself. It comes from the effort of maintaining a version of themselves designed to be accepted. Yet there is an important truth hidden beneath this exhaustion. The person who tries to please everyone eventually pleases no one, including themselves, because authenticity begins to disappear. When people sense that someone is constantly adjusting to be liked, trust becomes fragile. The personality appears unclear, shifting according to circumstances rather than grounded in conviction. The irony is difficult to ignore. In the attempt to secure approval, people often weaken the very qualities that inspire respect. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this internal conflict when he reminded himself that a person should aim to be good rather than merely appear agreeable. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, paragraph 55, he noted that living according to reason requires the courage to remain steady even when others misunderstand. This is where Stoic philosophy introduces a demanding but liberating challenge. If you constantly adjust yourself to avoid disapproval, you may gain temporary comfort, but you lose something far more important. Integrity. Integrity is the quiet alignment between what you believe and how you act. When that alignment is repeatedly sacrificed for the sake of approval, the mind begins to feel divided. One part of you knows what you truly think. Another part continues performing what feels acceptable. The greater this distance becomes, the heavier the emotional tax grows. Eventually, the mind begins to ask a deeper question. Why am I so afraid of displeasing others in the first place? Because beneath the effort to please everyone, there is usually a deeper force operating quietly. A force that shapes behavior long before approval is even requested. Fear. The fear that hides beneath approval. If you look closely at the need for approval, you will discover that it is rarely driven by kindness or diplomacy alone. Beneath the desire to be liked, there is usually something much older and more powerful guiding the mind. Fear, not always loud, not always visible, but present in quiet forms that influence behavior long before a decision is made. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear of standing alone. These fears often develop so early and so gradually that they begin to feel like natural instincts rather than learned reactions. The mind becomes trained to avoid any situation that might threaten acceptance. Disagreement feels dangerous. Criticism feels personal. Disapproval feels like exclusion. So the mind adapts. It learns to anticipate reactions before they occur. It studies the emotional atmosphere of each interaction. It predicts which opinions will be welcomed and which will disturb the room. And in order to avoid discomfort, it begins to choose the safest path. The path of agreement. Yet what appears as agreement is often only avoidance. This is the quiet mechanism through which fear disguises itself as politeness. You are not truly expressing what you believe. You are preventing a reaction that feels uncomfortable. Over time, this habit becomes automatic. The mind begins to avoid tension not because tension is harmful, but because tension threatens approval. Epictetus spoke about this pattern in a way that remains strikingly relevant. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 1, he explained that fear arises whenever we treat external things as necessary for our well-being. The moment acceptance becomes necessary for emotional stability, the mind becomes vulnerable to fear. Because acceptance cannot be controlled. If another person's approval determines whether you feel secure or unsettled, then every interaction becomes a potential threat. A raised eyebrow, a dismissive tone, a moment of disagreement can suddenly disturb your inner balance. This is why the fear beneath approval-seeking is so persistent. It is not simply fear of conflict. It is fear of losing the sense of safety that approval temporarily provides. But Stoic philosophy challenges this fear with a difficult question. Is acceptance truly the source of safety? Or have you only been trained to believe that it is? Marcus Aurelius reflected on this exact tension while reminding himself that the opinions of others cannot damage the soul unless we invite them to do so. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 47, he wrote that if someone criticizes you and the criticism is true, you should correct yourself. If it is false, then it should pass by you like a sound carried by the wind. Notice the simplicity of this reasoning. Truth deserves correction. False judgment deserves indifference. Fear, however, rarely allows such clarity. Fear magnifies the importance of every opinion. It transforms disagreement into danger and criticism into condemnation. As a result, the mind begins to treat every interaction as a delicate negotiation. Will they accept me? Will they disagree with me? Will this damage how they see me? The irony is profound. In trying to avoid rejection, the mind ends up living in constant anticipation of it. Instead of peace, it finds vigilance. Instead of freedom, it finds hesitation. And hesitation slowly erodes courage. Courage does not disappear suddenly. It fades quietly each time you remain silent when honesty would have been appropriate. It weakens each time you suppress a conviction because it might provoke disagreement. Eventually, the mind begins to confuse comfort with wisdom, but Stoicism refuses that confusion. The Stoics understood that a life guided by fear cannot produce tranquility. Peace requires something stronger than approval. It requires the ability to stand firmly in what belongs to you and release what never did, which leads to a realization that can change the way you interpret every reaction from the world around you. A realization the Stoics considered one of the most important discoveries a person can make. Not everything that disturbs your mind actually belongs to you. The Stoic discovery: not everything belongs to you. There comes a moment in the Stoic journey when a simple realization begins to rearrange the entire structure of your thinking. Many of the things that disturb your peace were never yours to control. This discovery may appear obvious at first, yet very few people truly live according to it. Most minds behave as though every opinion, every reaction, every outcome must somehow be managed, influenced, or corrected. If someone disapproves, the mind wants to repair it. If someone misunderstands, the mind wants to explain it. If someone criticizes, the mind wants to defend itself. And so a large part of life becomes an endless attempt to manage what lives inside other people's thoughts. The Stoics considered this one of the greatest sources of human frustration. Because no matter how intelligent, disciplined, or persuasive a person becomes, there is one territory that always remains beyond their authority: the minds of others. Epictetus expressed this principle with striking clarity. In Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 1. He begins with a statement that has guided Stoic thought for centuries. Some things are within our power, and some things are not. Within our power are our judgments, our intentions, our choices, and our actions. Outside our power are the opinions of others, the reactions of others, the events that unfold in the world, and the interpretations people form about who we are. This division is not philosophical decoration. It is a practical map of reality. Yet most people spend their lives ignoring this map. They try to influence how they are perceived. They try to avoid criticism. They try to control the way others interpret their behavior. And because these things cannot be fully controlled, the result is constant tension. Imagine carrying responsibility for the weather. Each time it rains, you feel that something has gone wrong. Each time the wind changes direction, you believe you should have prevented it. The burden would be absurd. Yet this is exactly the burden many people carry when they attempt to manage the opinions of others. They assume responsibility for reactions that arise from minds they do not inhabit and cannot direct. Marcus Aurelius confronted this illusion repeatedly in his private reflections. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 12, paragraph 22, he reminded himself that the disturbance caused by another person's judgment does not come from the judgment itself, but from the importance we assign to it. This is where the Stoic discovery begins to change the landscape of the mind. If someone misunderstands you, that misunderstanding belongs to their perception. If someone criticizes you unfairly, that criticism belongs to their interpretation. If someone approves of you, that approval belongs to their preference. None of these reactions originate within your character. They arise in a place that is separate from you. Once this becomes clear, a new question naturally appears. Why are you trying so hard to control what was never yours to control? The mind begins to recognize how much energy has been invested in managing the uncontrollable. Hours of reflection, emotional turbulence, and inner debate, all directed towards something that ultimately lives outside your reach. This realization does not mean that the opinions of others are meaningless. People influence opportunities, relationships, and circumstances. Stoicism does not deny the existence of social reality. What it denies is the belief that your inner stability should depend on it. Because the moment your peace depends on something outside your control, peace becomes fragile. It becomes vulnerable to every shifting mood, every misunderstanding, every passing judgment. The Stoic response is not indifference to people but clarity about responsibility. Your responsibility is to govern what belongs to you. Your thoughts, your choices, your character, your response to whatever happens. Everything else belongs to the unfolding of the world and the perceptions of others. Once this boundary becomes visible, something remarkable begins to happen. The chaos that once filled your mind starts separating into two distinct territories, one that is yours to shape and one that never was. Learning to see that boundary clearly is the next step in reclaiming your freedom. Drawing the line between what is yours and what is not. Understanding that not everything belongs to you is a powerful realization, yet the mind does not immediately change its habits simply because it understands a principle. Knowledge alone does not dissolve confusion. The real transformation begins when the boundary between what is yours and what is not becomes clear enough to guide your daily choices. Most people live with this boundary blurred. They feel responsible for reactions that arise in other minds, while neglecting the responsibility they hold over their own judgments. They worry about how they are perceived, yet rarely question how they themselves interpret the world. The Stoics insisted that this confusion must be corrected if a person wishes to live with stability. Epictetus returned to this teaching constantly because he understood that the mind easily drifts back into old patterns. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 5, he advised his students to examine every disturbance they experienced and ask a simple question. Does this belong to me, or does it belong to something outside my authority? At first, this question may seem almost too simple to matter, yet when applied honestly, it has the power to reorganize the entire structure of your attention. Consider a common situation. Someone criticizes your decision in a harsh or unfair way. The immediate reaction of the mind is often defensive. You feel the need to correct the judgment, to explain yourself, to prove that the criticism is misplaced. But pause and look carefully. The criticism itself exists in the mind of the person who formed it. Their interpretation belongs to them. Their reaction belongs to them. Their conclusion belongs to them. What belongs to you is your response. You can examine whether the criticism contains truth. If it does, reason invites correction. If it does not, reason invites dismissal. But the emotional storm that often follows criticism does not arise from the event itself. It arises from the belief that you must control how others see you. Once that belief weakens, the disturbance begins to lose its power. Marcus Aurelius practiced this discipline repeatedly in his own reflections. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 59, he reminded himself that other people act according to what appears right to them. Their judgments follow the logic of their own perceptions, whether those perceptions are accurate or not. Recognizing this removes a large portion of unnecessary conflict from the mind. When someone misunderstands you, the misunderstanding is not an attack on your character. It is the result of their interpretation of events. When someone praises you, the praise is not a confirmation of your virtue. It is simply their reaction to what they perceive. Both praise and criticism belong to the same external territory. Neither defines who you are. Drawing this line requires discipline because the mind is accustomed to crossing it. It wants to step into the domain of other people's thoughts and adjust them. It wants to shape perceptions, soften judgments, and secure approval. Yet every attempt to do so pulls attention away from the only domain where real authority exists: your own mind, your reasoning, your decisions, your conduct when circumstances challenge you. These are the areas where Stoic philosophy directs your effort. Once you begin to focus there, something important changes. Energy that was previously spent managing impressions becomes available for something far more valuable: clarity. Instead of asking how you are being perceived, you begin asking whether your actions align with reason and integrity. Instead of worrying about whether people approve, you begin examining whether your choices reflect the person you aim to become. This shift does not make life easier in the superficial sense. There will still be disagreements, misunderstandings, and moments when others judge you unfairly. But the difference is profound. Your peace no longer depends on resolving those judgments. Your peace depends on something entirely different: the condition of your own character. And once the mind begins to live according to that standard, another question emerges naturally. If the opinions of others do not belong to you, why does the mind cling to them so tightly in the first place? Why the mind clings to the judgment of others? Once you begin to understand that the opinions of others are outside your control, another question naturally appears. If these judgments do not belong to you, why does the mind care about them so intensely? Why does a single remark have the power to disturb your thoughts for hours, sometimes for days? The Stoics approached this question with honesty. They did not pretend that human beings are naturally indifferent to the judgments of others. On the contrary, they understood that the desire for acceptance is deeply rooted in the human condition. From the earliest stages of life, approval is associated with safety. A child receives warmth, attention, and protection when their behavior is accepted. When it is rejected, discomfort follows. Over time, the mind begins to associate approval with belonging and disapproval with exclusion. This pattern is powerful because for most of human history, belonging to a group was not simply a preference. It was necessary for survival. To be rejected by the tribe meant isolation. Isolation meant vulnerability. Even though modern life no longer operates under the same conditions, the instincts formed during those earlier stages of human development remain active. The mind still reacts to social judgment as though it carries the weight of survival. A raised voice feels threatening. A critical remark feels like a form of rejection. Disagreement can feel like a signal that you are being pushed outside the circle of acceptance. Without realizing it, the mind begins protecting itself by avoiding situations that might provoke these reactions. It becomes cautious with opinions, careful with decisions, sensitive to subtle shifts in how others respond. What appears to be politeness often hides a deeper impulse: the impulse to avoid social danger. The Stoics did not condemn this instinct. They understood that it arises naturally from the structure of human psychology. What they challenged was the idea that this instinct should govern your decisions. Epictetus addressed this conflict directly when he explained that the mind must learn to examine its impressions before obeying them. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 20, he described how the first reaction we feel is not always a reliable guide. The important task is to pause and ask whether the reaction reflects truth or merely habit. The fear triggered by disapproval is often one of these habits. It arises quickly, almost automatically. Someone questions your choice, and the mind immediately interprets the moment as a threat. Your thoughts begin searching for ways to defend yourself, to justify your decision or to soften the tension. Yet if you step back and observe the situation calmly, you may discover that nothing truly dangerous has occurred. Someone has formed an opinion. That is all. Their opinion may be mistaken. It may be incomplete. It may simply reflect their personal preferences. But the mind, trained by years of conditioning, reacts as though something essential has been put at risk. Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself that the judgments of others cannot harm the inner self unless we cooperate with them. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 52, he wrote that the soul becomes colored by its thoughts, meaning that what disturbs us is not the external event, but the interpretation we attach to it. When the mind believes that approval equals safety, every judgment becomes emotionally charged. But when the mind learns to see judgments as passing impressions in other people's thoughts, their power begins to fade. This does not mean that criticism will never affect you. Stoicism does not remove human sensitivity. What it does is introduce a moment of clarity between the event and your reaction. Instead of automatically seeking approval, the mind begins to ask a different question. Is this judgment true? If it is true, it offers an opportunity for improvement. If it is false, it deserves no authority over your peace. This simple shift transforms the way you relate to social reactions. Approval becomes pleasant but unnecessary. Disapproval becomes informative but not threatening. And as the mind grows more comfortable with this distinction, another illusion begins to reveal itself. The illusion that reputation defines who you are. The illusion of reputation. Once the mind begins to see how strongly it reacts to the opinions of others, another illusion slowly comes into focus. The belief that reputation is the same thing as character. Many people move through life treating these two things as though they were identical. If others speak well of them, they feel secure. If criticism spreads, they feel diminished. Praise becomes proof of worth, and disapproval becomes evidence of failure. But Stoic philosophy insists on separating these two ideas with absolute clarity. Reputation exists in the minds of other people. Character exists in your actions. One is external and unstable. The other is internal and entirely within your authority. Yet the mind often confuses them because reputation is visible, while character is quiet. Reputation is spoken about, shared, repeated, and amplified. Character is revealed only through conduct, and often without applause. Because of this difference, many people begin investing their effort in the wrong place. They try to manage how they appear rather than how they act. A person may carefully craft an image of intelligence, kindness, or confidence while neglecting the harder work of actually developing those qualities. Others may silence their true thoughts or suppress honest disagreement because they fear how it might affect their reputation. Slowly, a life begins to form around maintaining appearances. The Stoics viewed this as one of the most dangerous confusions a person can fall into. Seneca addressed it with remarkable precision when he warned that the admiration of the crowd often reflects what is fashionable rather than what is virtuous. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 79, he explained that reputation follows the shifting preferences of society, while virtue follows the steady guidance of reason. These two paths rarely move together. A person may be widely admired and yet lack integrity. Another may be misunderstood or criticized while living according to the highest principles. History offers many examples of this contrast. People who were condemned in their time later became symbols of wisdom, while others who enjoyed praise during their lifetime were eventually remembered for their lack of substance. This instability reveals something important. Reputation is not a reliable measure of who you are. It is a reflection of how others perceive you at a particular moment, filtered through their expectations, their values, and sometimes their misunderstandings. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this truth repeatedly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, paragraph 19, he reflected on how quickly fame fades and how little control we have over the stories others tell about us. One generation praises you, another forgets you, a third misinterprets you entirely. If reputation shifts so easily across time and perspective, how could it possibly define your worth? Yet the mind continues chasing it as though it were something solid. Consider how much energy is spent maintaining an image. People choose words carefully to appear agreeable. They hide uncertainty to appear confident. They avoid honest disagreement to preserve harmony. These adjustments may seem harmless, but they gradually replace authenticity with performance. You begin acting according to what protects your reputation, rather than what reflects your character. This is where the illusion becomes dangerous. Because once reputation becomes the focus, the mind begins sacrificing truth for approval. It becomes more concerned with being perceived as good than with actually becoming good. Stoicism rejects this reversal completely. The Stoics believed that the only thing worthy of your full attention is the condition of your character, your honesty, your discipline, your fairness, your courage in difficult moments. These qualities do not depend on applause. They depend on the choices you make when no one is watching. Reputation may follow those choices, or it may not. That outcome belongs to the perceptions of others, but character remains yours. When the mind finally understands this distinction, something important changes. The need to manage appearances begins to lose its urgency. You realize that no matter how carefully you shape your image, the final version of you will always exist inside someone else's interpretation. And interpretations can never be fully controlled. This realization leads to a different way of facing the world. Instead of trying to protect your reputation from every possible criticism, you begin learning how to accept what cannot be controlled. Which brings us to one of the most misunderstood teachings in Stoic philosophy: the acceptance of fate. Acceptance of fate as liberation. For many people, the idea of accepting fate sounds like surrender. It appears to suggest passivity, resignation, or a quiet withdrawal from the effort to shape one's life. Yet this interpretation could not be further from what the Stoics actually meant. To the Stoic mind, accepting fate is not weakness. It is clarity. It begins with the recognition that reality unfolds according to countless forces that do not answer to our preferences. Events occur, people form judgments, circumstances shift, and outcomes emerge from chains of cause and effect that extend far beyond the reach of our will. The mistake most people make is not that these things happen. The mistake is believing they should not. When reality contradicts expectation, resistance begins. The mind argues with events that have already occurred. It replays situations, searching for ways the outcome should have been different. It becomes irritated by the fact that others misunderstand, criticize, or disagree. In this quiet struggle against what already exists, a great deal of energy is wasted. The Stoics saw this struggle as unnecessary suffering. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with remarkable simplicity. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, paragraph 23, he reminded himself that everything that happens is part of a larger order of events. The task of a rational mind is not to resent this order, but to understand its place within it. Acceptance begins at the moment you stop demanding that reality behave according to your wishes. This does not mean abandoning effort or refusing to act. Stoicism never encourages passivity. The Stoic continues to act with discipline, intention, and courage. What changes is the relationship to the outcome. You work with commitment, but you do not demand that the world reward that effort in a particular way. You speak honestly, but you do not require that others agree. You pursue what reason suggests is right, but you accept that misunderstanding and criticism may follow. This is where acceptance becomes liberation. When the mind stops resisting what cannot be changed, it recovers a great amount of emotional strength. Energy that was previously spent fighting reality becomes available for something far more useful: action. Epictetus often reminded his students that events themselves do not disturb us. What disturbs us is the demand that events should have been different. In Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 8, he explained that tranquility emerges when we learn to desire things to happen as they actually happen. This teaching is often misunderstood as fatalism. In truth, it is a discipline of perception. You still prefer certain outcomes. You still pursue improvement and justice and wisdom. But you no longer build your peace on the assumption that the world must obey your preferences. Life includes misunderstanding. Life includes criticism. Life includes moments where others judge you unfairly. Once this becomes clear, the fear surrounding those possibilities begins to dissolve. You realize that disapproval is not a catastrophe. It is simply another event within the unfolding of life. The Stoics describe this attitude with a phrase that has echoed across centuries: amor fati, the love of fate. Not merely the acceptance of events, but the willingness to embrace them as part of the path you are meant to walk. When the mind adopts this perspective, something remarkable happens. Instead of being disturbed by every unfavorable reaction, you begin to see those reactions as part of the landscape of human life. Just as wind and rain belong to the weather, disagreement and judgment belong to society. You no longer waste energy trying to prevent what cannot be prevented. Instead, your attention turns inward, toward the one domain where freedom truly exists, the discipline of the inner world. Reclaiming authority over the inner world. Once a person begins to accept what lies beyond their control, a quiet shift starts to take place. The attention that was once scattered across the reactions, judgments, and expectations of others slowly returns to the one place where real authority exists. The inner world. For many people, this territory has been neglected for years. The mind becomes so occupied with managing appearances, predicting reactions, and avoiding disapproval that it rarely stops to examine its own judgments. Thoughts pass through without scrutiny. Emotions rise without being questioned. Reactions become habits rather than choices. The Stoics believed that this is where true discipline begins, not in controlling the behavior of others, but in governing the movements of one's own mind. Marcus Aurelius spoke to himself constantly about this responsibility. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 48, he reminded himself that the soul becomes shaped by the quality of its thoughts. If the mind fills itself with resentment, fear, and constant concern for external approval, then the soul takes on the same restless character. But if the mind learns to observe its own impressions and test them against reason, something different begins to emerge. Stability. Reclaiming authority over the inner world begins with a simple but demanding practice. Each time a strong reaction appears, the mind pauses long enough to examine it. A criticism arrives and irritation rises immediately. Instead of reacting automatically, you ask a question. Does this judgment reveal something I must correct? Or is it simply another person's opinion passing through their own perspective? A moment of disapproval occurs and anxiety begins forming in your thoughts. Instead of obeying that anxiety, you examine it. What exactly am I afraid of losing in this moment? Is my character at risk, or only my image in someone else's mind? These questions create distance between the event and your response. They interrupt the automatic patterns that once governed your behavior. Epictetus described this discipline as the examination of impressions. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 1, he advised his students to treat every impression as a messenger that must be questioned before it is believed. The mind should not immediately accept what it feels, but should ask whether the impression reflects truth. This practice gradually restores authority to the individual. Instead of reacting to every stimulus from the outside world, the mind begins to filter those stimuli through reason. Some reactions are accepted because they reveal something useful. Others are dismissed because they carry no real importance. The result is a growing sense of independence. You no longer feel compelled to respond to every opinion. You no longer feel responsible for correcting every misunderstanding. You begin to recognize that many disturbances only gain power when the mind cooperates with them. Marcus Aurelius captured this insight when he reminded himself that the mind can always choose how it interprets events. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 8, he wrote that if you are distressed by anything external, the disturbance does not arise from the thing itself but from your judgment about it, and judgments can be revised. This realization does not make the world quieter. People will still form opinions. They will still praise and criticize, agree and disagree, admire and misunderstand. But the internal reaction begins to change. The mind no longer rushes outward to defend its image. It remains centered on a different question. Did I act according to reason and integrity? If the answer is yes, then the reaction of others loses its authority. If the answer is no, then correction becomes possible without the need for shame or defensiveness. This shift creates a new kind of confidence, not the loud confidence that seeks recognition, but a quieter stability that comes from self-governance. Yet living according to this stability requires something that many people find difficult: the willingness to act according to your judgment, even when approval is absent. which leads to the next challenge the Stoics placed before every student of philosophy: learning to practice courage without applause, courage in the absence of applause. One of the quiet tests of character appears when you must act according to your judgment without knowing whether anyone will approve. Most people imagine courage as something dramatic, a moment of visible bravery, a decision that draws admiration, a stand that others recognize and praise. But Stoic philosophy presents a much quieter form of courage, the courage to remain faithful to reason, even when no applause follows. This form of courage rarely attracts attention. It appears in ordinary situations where the pressure to conform is subtle but constant. A conversation where everyone agrees with an idea you know is flawed. A decision where choosing what is right may lead to misunderstanding. A path that aligns with your principles but diverges from what others expect. In these moments, the mind feels a familiar tension. Part of you knows what reason suggests is right. Another part anticipates the reaction that decision might provoke. If approval has been guiding your life, the instinct is to soften your position, to delay the decision, to search for a compromise that preserves acceptance. Yet Stoicism asks a different question. What does reason demand, regardless of whether it is welcomed? Marcus Aurelius reflected on this responsibility often, reminding himself that the value of an action does not depend on the praise it receives. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 5, Paragraph 1, he wrote that the task of a human being is to do what belongs to a human being, to act with justice, honesty, and discipline, simply because these qualities are right, not because they produce admiration. This perspective removes a powerful illusion, the illusion that courage requires recognition. In reality, most courageous acts pass unnoticed. They occur quietly in moments where a person refuses to betray their own judgment. They speak honestly when silence would have been easier. They walk away from paths that conflict with their values even when those paths promise approval. The absence of applause often reveals the true strength of character, because when admiration is removed, only intention remains. The question becomes simple. Are you acting according to what you believe is right, or according to what others will reward? Epictetus warned that those who depend on approval for motivation will struggle to maintain integrity when approval disappears. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 3, Chapter 24, he explained that the person who wishes to live freely must stop seeking validation from those whose opinions shift with circumstances. Otherwise, every action becomes a negotiation between principle and acceptance. Many people lose this negotiation slowly, not through a single betrayal of their values, but through small adjustments that seem harmless at first. A thought left unspoken, a conviction softened, a decision postponed because the reaction of others feels uncertain. Over time, these adjustments accumulate. The mind begins to prioritize comfort over truth. Approval becomes easier to maintain than honesty. The person still believes they are acting wisely, but a quiet distance forms between what they truly think and what they allow themselves to express. Stoicism challenges this pattern directly. It asks the individual to measure actions according to a different standard, not popularity, not agreement, not applause, only alignment with reason and virtue. This standard can feel demanding because it removes many of the familiar rewards people rely on. There may be moments when you act correctly and still face criticism, moments when honesty leads to misunderstanding, moments when integrity feels lonely. But these moments reveal something essential. When your actions no longer depend on approval, they begin to depend on character. And character grows stronger each time you choose reason over comfort. This strength does not appear suddenly. It develops gradually as the mind learns that it can endure disapproval without losing its balance. Once that realization takes root, another change begins to occur. You stop waiting for permission to act according to what you know is right. The discipline of acting without permission. Many people live as though an invisible authority must first approve their choices before they are allowed to act. No one openly demands this permission, yet the mind waits for it. It waits for reassurance that the decision will be accepted, that the direction will be understood, that the choice will not disturb the expectations of others. Until that reassurance appears, Hesitation fills the space. Ideas remain unspoken, decisions remain delayed, paths that call for courage remain unexplored. The person continues thinking, analyzing, and preparing, but something always holds the final step back. That invisible restraint is the habit of waiting for permission. Not legal permission, not formal approval, but emotional permission from the imagined judgment of others. The mind asks questions that rarely lead to action. Will people support this decision? Will they understand what I am doing? Will this make me appear unreasonable or selfish? What seems like careful consideration is often something else entirely, a quiet dependence on validation. The Stoics recognized how easily this dependence can control a person's life, because when every decision must first pass through the anticipated reactions of others, action becomes slow, uncertain, and easily abandoned. Epictetus warned about this form of hesitation with remarkable clarity. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 4, Chapter 1, he explained that the person who seeks approval before acting will remain trapped between intention and execution. Their mind will always be divided between what reason suggests and what acceptance requires. The result is paralysis disguised as caution. Stoicism offers a different model of discipline. Act according to reason, and let the reaction of others unfold as it will. This principle does not encourage recklessness or disregard for the consequences of one's actions. Stoic discipline still requires careful thought and responsibility. But once reason has examined the situation and reached a conclusion, action must follow. Otherwise, the mind remains trapped in endless negotiation. Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself of this responsibility. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, Paragraph 54, he reflected on the importance of moving directly from clear judgment to clear action, without becoming entangled in the imagined reactions of others. Because every delay created by fear weakens the authority of reason. Consider how often people postpone decisions not because they lack understanding, but because they anticipate discomfort. They imagine criticism, disagreement, or confusion, and these imagined reactions become obstacles more powerful than the situation itself. Yet those reactions exist only in the mind. They are predictions, not realities. And even if they do occur, they remain outside the domain that belongs to you. Your responsibility is not to ensure that everyone accepts your decisions. Your responsibility is to ensure that your decisions arise from thoughtful judgment and honest intention. When the mind accepts this responsibility fully, something begins to change. Action becomes clearer. Instead of waiting for external reassurance, the person begins asking a simpler question. Is this decision aligned with reason and integrity? If the answer is yes, then hesitation loses its purpose. You speak when honesty calls for speech. You change direction when reason shows that a new path is necessary. You pursue goals that reflect your convictions even when they are unfamiliar to others. Gradually, the mind becomes less concerned with the approval surrounding an action, and more concerned with the quality of the action itself. This shift restores momentum to life. Choices are no longer suspended in uncertainty. The individual stops seeking permission from a world that cannot provide it consistently. They begin trusting the only authority that can guide them with stability, their own examined judgment. And as this discipline strengthens, another transformation quietly emerges. The mind begins to experience a kind of calm that does not depend on agreement, praise, or validation. The calm that comes from inner alignment. When a person stops chasing approval and begins acting according to reason, a quiet transformation takes place inside the mind. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. The old habit of seeking reassurance from others does not disappear immediately. The mind may still anticipate criticism. It may still feel the familiar tension when disagreement appears. But something deeper has already started to shift. The center of stability begins to move inward. Instead of measuring peace by the reactions of others, you begin measuring it by something far more reliable: the alignment between what you believe and how you act. This alignment creates a form of calm that many people rarely experience. Not the calm that comes from avoiding difficulty, but the calm that comes from internal coherence. Your thoughts, your words, and your actions begin moving in the same direction. There is no longer a hidden negotiation happening inside you. Before this alignment, The mind is often divided. One part understands what reason suggests. Another part worries about how that choice will be received. The result is hesitation, self-doubt, and a constant effort to balance truth with acceptance. But when approval stops being the measure of your decisions, that inner division begins to dissolve. You no longer ask whether others will agree with your choice before you make it. You ask whether the choice reflects the principles you are committed to living by. Marcus Aurelius described this kind of inner order in a way that reveals its quiet strength. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 3, he reflected that the person who lives according to reason carries a kind of inner fortress that cannot easily be disturbed by external events. This fortress is not built from stubbornness or indifference. It is built from clarity. Clarity about what belongs to you and what does not. Clarity about what your responsibility truly is. Clarity about the difference between your character and the shifting opinions of the world. Once these distinctions settle in the mind, many of the anxieties that once felt overwhelming begin to lose their intensity. Criticism still occurs, but it no longer shakes your foundation. Disagreement still appears, but it does not force you to question your entire direction. Praise may still arrive, but it does not become something you depend upon. Your sense of balance no longer rises and falls with these reactions. It rests on the knowledge that your actions are guided by examined judgment rather than by fear. Epictetus explained that true freedom emerges when the mind stops attaching its peace to things that lie outside its control. In Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 14, he reminded his students that the person who places their good within their own choices cannot easily be disturbed by the behavior of others. This freedom creates a different emotional landscape. Instead of constant vigilance, the mind experiences steadiness. Instead of anticipating judgment, attention returns to the present task. Instead of replaying conversations in search of approval, the mind moves forward without needing confirmation. This calm does not mean life becomes simple or conflict disappears. People will still misunderstand you. Situations will still challenge your patience. Circumstances will still test your discipline. But the difference lies in how those moments are received. When your actions reflect your principles, you carry a quiet confidence that does not depend on external validation. Even when others disagree, you remain grounded in the knowledge that your choices were made with honesty and thoughtfulness. And this grounded state produces something that many people search for without understanding where it comes from. Self-respect. Not the fragile confidence that depends on praise, but the deeper respect that grows when you consistently act according to your values. Once this respect begins to form, the entire relationship with approval changes, because approval is no longer the source of your stability. It becomes something secondary. When self-respect replaces approval, there is a decisive turning point in a person's life that rarely appears dramatic from the outside, yet changes everything within. It is the moment when self-respect begins to matter more than approval. Until that moment arrives, the mind constantly negotiates with the expectations of others. Decisions are filtered through imagined reactions. Words are adjusted to maintain acceptance. Even personal goals are shaped by what will appear impressive or acceptable to those watching. But once self-respect becomes the guiding principle, the entire structure of decision-making begins to shift. You no longer ask what will earn admiration. You ask what allows you to remain honest with yourself. This question carries a different weight. Approval is temporary. It rises and falls depending on circumstance, mood, and misunderstanding. Self-respect, however, grows from something far more stable. It grows from knowing that your actions reflect the values you claim to believe in. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea again and again in his private reflections. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, Paragraph 30, he reminded himself that the true measure of a person is not what others say about them, but whether they live in harmony with their own principles. Living in this harmony changes the emotional atmosphere of life. When approval guides your choices, you must constantly adjust to maintain it. One moment of disapproval can disturb your confidence. One misunderstanding can cause you to question your entire direction. But when self-respect becomes the foundation, that instability begins to disappear. You still listen to others. You still consider advice and criticism carefully. Stoicism never suggests ignoring feedback or isolating yourself from the wisdom of others. The difference is that your final judgment no longer depends on their reaction. It depends on whether your actions reflect reason, fairness, and discipline. This shift transforms how you experience disagreement. When approval is your goal, disagreement feels threatening. It feels like a signal that something about you is being rejected. The mind rushes to repair the situation, soften the opinion, or withdraw the idea. But when self-respect guides you, disagreement becomes simply another perspective in the world. It may contain useful insight. It may contain misunderstanding. Either way, it no longer has the authority to determine your worth. Seneca expressed this independence clearly when he wrote that the wise person values the judgment of their own conscience above the applause of the crowd. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 71, he explained that integrity requires a person to become the guardian of their own conduct rather than a performer for public approval. This does not mean the path becomes easier. In fact, the moment self-respect replaces approval, certain illusions disappear. You begin to see clearly that not everyone will agree with your decisions. Some people will misunderstand your intentions. Others may criticize what they do not fully see. Yet this clarity removes a burden that many people carry for years. The burden of trying to be accepted by everyone. Because once self-respect becomes your compass, you understand something simple and liberating. Universal approval is impossible. People disagree because they see the world through different experiences, values, and expectations. Trying to align with every one of those perspectives would require abandoning your own. Stoicism asks you to do the opposite, to cultivate a character strong enough to remain steady even when others misunderstand it. This steadiness gradually becomes visible in the way you move through life. Your words become more direct. Your boundaries become clearer. Your decisions become less influenced by momentary reactions. Not because you have become indifferent to people, but because you have become loyal to your principles. And from that loyalty, something rare begins to emerge. A freedom that does not depend on praise. The freedom of a mind that needs nothing. There is a kind of freedom that many people search for in circumstances, achievements, or recognition. They imagine that peace will arrive once the world responds to them in the right way. Once they are respected enough, understood enough, admired enough. But the Stoics discovered something far more powerful. Peace does not come from arranging the world around you. It comes from no longer needing the world to confirm who you are. This realization changes the entire direction of a person's life. When the need for approval fades, the mind becomes lighter. It no longer carries the constant burden of managing impressions or protecting an image. Because conflict disappears, but because the mind is no longer fighting battles that never belonged to it. Marcus Aurelius described this inner independence with remarkable clarity. Relationships, community, or respect lose their value. Human beings are meant to live among others. Stoicism never denies the importance of friendship, cooperation, and mutual understanding. Emotional stability no longer rises and falls with the shifting opinions of the world. Instead, it rests on something far more durable. Your will. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 1, he explained that when a person governs their judgments and actions wisely, nothing external can rob them of their peace. This teaching reveals a powerful truth. People may still misunderstand you. They may disagree with your decisions. Some may approve, others may criticize. These reactions will continue to exist because human beings see the world through different perspectives. Philosophy places such emphasis on personal responsibility. You're not responsible for the opinions of the world. You are responsible for the condition of your own character, exactly as you hoped. It depends only on your willingness to live according to what you know is right. This is the freedom the Stoics spoke about. Not the freedom to control the world, but the freedom to remain steady within it.